Hi there! My name is Alice, and today I am going to be showing you how I have used the System 3 acrylic inks to create my most recent artwork. So I am so excited to be showing you how I use these different inks, and first I want to tell you a little bit about the System 3 inks before we jump into it. These inks have 28 colors. They're all opaque or semi-opaque, and this is part of the System 3 acrylic range, so the colors are all going to match the original System 3 acrylic range, which features 54 colors. One of the things that is really amazing about these inks is that you can use them on a variety of different surfaces. So the surface that I chose for this picture was wood, and I wanted to use a variety of different techniques on this wood board. And so the first thing that you actually saw me do was go straight into the unprimed board with a watered down solution of the acrylic inks. What this is going to do is it's going to stain the wood grain with the colors, and you're still going to see that beautiful wood grain shine through, and you're going to have a variety of different opacities. So even though these inks are so opaque, you can water them down with water because they are water-based inks and create a thin wash of color. However, when the colors dry, they are totally water resistant, so you can layer on top of them as much as you want without disturbing any of the layers underneath, which is so useful for when you make mistakes, need to correct things, or when you're just building up on top of it. Daler-Rowney does recommend preparing the surface and testing on a small area first, and after testing I was able to find out that this wood did work fine unprimed, which was really great because it enabled me to use this technique of watering down the inks and having that wood grain shine through. The inks themselves stuck amazingly to the wood on top of that, and as you can see, I was able to build them up to create a overall layout of the image. So I started by throwing in all those different colors. I think it's really important to work an entire piece at once. So you lay down one layer everywhere, then the next layer everywhere. That way you're not just finishing one section before moving on to the next section, and it allows you to see how everything is working together as a whole. Once I had all of those flat layers in, I started to define the shirt. Because I wanted to work with the layering properties of the inks, I made sure to work from back to front so that I could have all my layers in the correct order. So that's one of the reasons I started with the shirt. So for the shirt, I wanted to have this dreamlike cloud effect. So I had this reference photo of clouds. I adjusted the colors to make them really nice and purple with a little hint of peach. And then I went in with the acrylic inks. So these acrylic inks are more opaque than other ink ranges. And the thing that makes that so useful is because they are very opaque, but also very fluid and thin, you can build up in a lot of different manners. As you saw at the beginning, I was able to work wet on wet with these acrylic inks and create a very opaque, but clouded and blended look at the beginning, which enabled me to then go up and build on top of those clouds and have that base layer of wet on wet blending that helps give it this very dreamlike and soft effect. Wet on wet is a technique that I find so useful in watercolor, but can be difficult to achieve with a lot of opaque mediums because the paint needs to be very fluid in order to accomplish this. Because these inks are very fluid, as they are inks and not acrylic paint, that enables you to create these wet on wet looks that you wouldn't normally be able to achieve as easily with an acrylic paint. That was so wonderful to play with, and probably one of my favorite parts about using these inks. After I had the shirt kind of laid out, all of the clouds were blocked in, I went into the backpack. The main color scheme for this piece that I was working with was these greens, both blue greens and some yellow greens, as well as teals and purples. And so the backpack incorporates all of these different colors. With this piece, I really wanted to subvert expectations, and so I inverted the warm and cool colors to where you would normally expect them to be. Cool colors tend to recede into the background, and so they're most frequently used in shadows, Warm colors, however, tend to pull forward and the viewer tends to see them first. So a lot of times warm colors will be focused on in the highlights. But for this piece, I wanted to flip things around, so I used those warm purples in the shadows and the more cool colors in the front, and that creates a sort of visual juxtaposition that has your eye ever so slightly fighting with itself because it sort of wants to flatten out those shadows and pull them forward and then push the highlights back. Like I mentioned before, these inks are very fluid because they're inks. So that makes blending really, really easy to accomplish while also creating a thin layer. Sometimes with acrylic paints, I find myself adding a lot more paint than I actually need to. And so with these inks, I was able to lay down the colors, then I would slightly dry the brush off by brushing it along a rag. And then I would use that more dry brush, still with the same color, to just kind of fluff out and disperse and diffuse the edges between the colors. And that's one of the ways that I was able to blend with these different inks. Now, for the backpack, I wanted all of these succulents exploding out of the backpack. It turns out succulents are actually rather difficult to paint, so this painting was definitely a learning experience for me. But I found that they worked well when I went in and blocked in the leaves first. Then I would go in with a little bit of a darker ink. This would be the Payne's Gray mixed in with a few of the other greens and purples. And I would go around and define the darkest shadows, then go back in with the highlights, and then start fleshing things out from there. These inks are so pigmented. They are actually made with real pigments, so all the artworks are going to be light, fast, and permanent, which is amazing. But I would recommend just using a tiny, tiny drop of color if you want a very pale pastel color, like I have with this area that I'm going over right now, this bright kind of highlight. Because those colors are so light, you only need just a tiny, tiny drop of the color. Otherwise, it's going to get saturated real fast. So that is one of my tips for you, is use your colors sparingly. These should last you for a while. So moving on, working on these purple and pink succulents up here in the corner, I'm trying a little bit of a different technique based on that first one where I am just blocking everything out, and then I'll go back in and define things later. As I said, I like to work the whole piece at once, and when I was working on those succulents before the green ones, I realized I was focusing in on those succulents, so I started going around and starting to try to block in some of the other areas of the features as well. So I moved on to the hand, which was extraordinarily difficult. All artists know, I think, that hands can be extremely tricky, so this was definitely a learning experience for me. But what I ended up doing was going over with the pigment ink and blocking everything out and making it a lot more simpler, which I think helped the shape of that hand come through. This is where the opaqueness of these inks and the water resistance is so useful, because I can layer them up so easily. I was able to go and totally correct that mistake and paint right over the hand and redo it with no problem, which I really appreciated. They do have a really great covering power. As you could see, I just was able to go right over it. So super, super useful. Moving on to the face, I continued to work in areas where I was blocking out those individual colors, and then I worked on blending both with the feathering out method and also just by simply using small strokes that went with the flow and the three-dimensionality of the face, and I was able to use that to create a visual blending. Then I went onto the hair and started blocking out the basic shapes of where the highlights were going to be, so that I at least had an idea of the hair around the face. And then once I kind of had the overall blocking in of the whole piece, I finally got to go in and start refining stuff. So I jumped back on over to the succulents, because the succulents were my biggest challenge in this piece. So I decided I just wanted to tackle it. And this is where I finally started to feel like I was getting the hang of what it's like to paint succulents. And I'm actually really pleased with how this specific part of the piece came out. You can see that I was able to use a few wet on wet techniques in the succulents as well. You can lay down that color, and then while it's still wet, you can drop in the next color. One thing that helped me out tremendously when painting this succulent was preparing all of the ink colors beforehand. I found it very, very helpful to use a palette with lots of individual wells, and then I would individually mix the light color, medium color, dark color, and use those to lay down those base kind of almost a cell shading look of layers. Then you can go in and subtly mix those colors together to create more depth and more blending, and add in a variety of different shades so you don't just have the original 3 or 4 that you mixed. So that was something that worked really, really well for me. If you have these inks or you want to try these inks, I would definitely encourage using a palette with a lot of different wells, because the inks are so fluid. It makes it a lot easier than using a flat palette where they can kind of run together. These inks can be dripped because they have this dropper and because they are so fluid, and you can pour them. So it really does give you a lot of versatility, which is very, very exciting if you enjoy working in mixed media, or if you enjoy working and experimenting with different techniques that create a lot of texture, which is something that I am very passionate about and interested in myself. So the next thing, the next layer that I was very excited to add on, and I couldn't add this layer on until those succulents were completed, was this white drop shadow. Essentially, I would say it's a drop shadow, and I have that on the left side, and then as you can see, I have a darker, almost cut out shadow on the right side. And what I wanted were for these shadows to be ever so slightly offset with the figure, so they're in a way cutting into it. I also went in and finished the detailing on the hair and the face. I used a fine brush to add in a lot of different shadows. This is again where the fluidity of the inks really came in useful. You really don't have to worry too much about the inks skipping or anything like that. You're able to create a really smooth line, which made them perfect for doing all of this outline work that I have and creating these very crisp edges, which are really necessary for this piece to work. I also went in and added a little bit more detail to her face. I added in some purple freckles, and then I continued on with the rest of the white line art that was around the piece. I used the white to also define some folds in the hoodie and to define the hood, so it wasn't quite so much a cloudy mass, but instead actually looks like clothing that she is wearing, even if it is kind of flattened out. This piece definitely had a lot of different parts and layers, and it took me some time to complete. I worked on it for about a 2-week period on and off. So one of the things that I do recommend when you're working with these inks is to make sure that at the beginning of your session, you are mixing them up either by using a spatula, shaking the bottles to redisperse the solids once it's all mixed up. And the reason for that is because these inks are pigment-based, the solids and the liquids are going to kind of separate when they're sitting. So it's always good to give it a mix-up so you're getting the most pigment out of your paints as possible. One of the last things that I needed to finish was to go back to the bane of my existence, the succulents. At this point, I was feeling a lot more confident painting succulents, however, so I'm glad that I kind of moved on from it and then came back because I think I improved a lot in my succulent painting technique. So I think the moral of this story is if you need to paint succulents, paint a lot of them, and by the end, you will be able to figure it out. Or more generally, just keep trying because you will learn and things take time. So that is the piece that I created with the Daler-Rowney System 3 inks. I really enjoyed working on this piece and the versatility that the inks provided me, as well as being able to work on a wood panel. It was really refreshing and also inspiring to me, and I love the way that it looks in the end with the raw edges. The last finishing thing that I did was to paint those last little edges white, so it has this nice crisp white border on it. And I'm so pleased with the final look. I hope this video was informative and inspiring to you. I hope that it gave you some ideas about how to use the System 3 inks. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day. Bye-bye!